It's only been a few months into 2026 and already three African countries are faced with the same similar global pressure from three very different positions. Zimbabwe is our first country we'll look at. Zimbabwe walked away from a major United States health funding arrangement that currently supports HIV treatment for well over a million people. That's a lot. Kenya returned to negotiations with the IMF after its previous multi-billion dollar program failed to complete its final review in 2025, leaving a large final disbursement undispersed. So there's a lot of money that they didn't end up receiving. Senegal is still working to restore access to the IMF support, and after an audit in 2024 revealed several billion dollars in previously undisclosed debt, and this essentially triggered the suspension of a major financing program. These are not separate stories, they are three different governments dealing with the same structural reality: how to keep their countries running when the money that they need is not fully under their control. A modern state has three bills it cannot avoid. The first one being keeping people alive and supported, that's me and you, making its own economic decisions, essentially its sovereignty. And the third one, and I think is the most important, buying time when money runs short. Most countries can only afford two. Time in the system has a very specific meaning. We're essentially talking about how a country has the ability to continue financing its budget on its own terms. That's what we're referring to when we're talking about time. It is the ability for a country to continue financing its budget on its own terms. As long as investors and lenders are willing to fund you at a manageable cost, you still control the pace of your own adjustment. When that changes, your timeline is no longer yours, because every government is funding the same basic obligations: social programs, public wages, infrastructure, and debt repayments. If it cannot raise enough money domestically, it must go to capital markets or official lenders. It must look externally. But you see, external finances never come without conditions. No money comes free, right? Zimbabwe in 2026 is facing that reality in the most human form. The United States supported programs currently provide life sustaining HIV treatment to more than a million Zimbabweans. Walking away from a major funding agreement is therefore not an abstract diplomatic decision. It affects medicine in clinics. It affects whether treatment programs remain stable. The dispute centered on a long-term access to sensitive national health data without a clear guarantee that Zimbabwe would benefit from any future medical products developed from it. So essentially, there was no guarantee that all the data that the United States was going to harvest were Zimbabweans going to benefit from the products in terms of the financial gains, because we all know that these medical products, they need to be bought by countries. Was Zimbabwe going to benefit from their sensitive national health data being part of the reason why those products are being made? And there was also not a guarantee that, let's say there was a pandemic and then one of the products would help Zimbabwe within that pandemic. There was no guarantee that Zimbabwe was going to have access to that product. So essentially, that was mostly the core of the dispute that ultimately led Zimbabwe to walk away from over $367 million. So the state made a structural choice. It protected future policy control and accepted immediate pressure on welfare provision. That is a conscious trade-off. Kenya's position is a lot more different. We now move on to Kenya. Its previous IMF program went off track before the final review in 2025, and a significant final disbursement was never released. Now, I just wanted to add a did you know? When you've got a situation, when a country goes to the IMF will say this country has got, you are entitled to over 3 billion because you're essentially looking for a loan. So the IMF says, listen, we can loan you up to $3 billion. Now, here's the thing. They don't give you the $3 billion up front. They give you in tranches. So immediately they'll give you $600 million, right? So they give you $600 million and they say, okay, right, we're going to do another test. and if you pass the second test, then we can disperse more money to you. So let's say in Kenya's case, for example, the first test that they had, they get the $600 million. Then the second test, they get another $600 million. Then the third test that the IMF posted to Kenya, or they review Kenya then fails, then the money then comes to a halt. I hope I just wanted to explain that because I found it really interesting. I always just used to think that the IMF, just when you go to the IMF and you ask for a loan, they just give you all the money up front. But no, it's not actually the case. Anyways, let's get back to Kenya, right? In 2026, the government is negotiating again, not because the money is already built into the budget, but because an IMF agreement restores international investor confidence. That confidence keeps capital flowing. It stabilizes borrowing, but it comes with negotiated fiscal targets. So Kenya is protecting access to financing and buying time. And in doing so, it gives up a part of its independent policy space, because there are always two audiences: the voters in the streets and the bond market. And in moments of financial pressure, both can be satisfied at the same time. So essentially, going to the IMF proves as a way of indicating to the markets that you've got an ability to pay off your loans, which is, you know, I find it's a weird thing how the markets work, man. It's a weird thing how the markets work. But anyways, listen, let's move on to Senegal. Senegal represents the third position. In 2024, an audit revealed several $billion in previously undisclosed public liabilities. The IMF suspended a major program until the full scale of the debt was clarified. Without the support, Senegal has relied more heavily on short-term and more expensive regional borrowing. As debt service costs rise, a large share of public revenue goes to past obligation and less to future development. Formal sovereignty remains, but control over the timeline of adjustments becomes narrower. That is what losing time looks like. You do not see it first in speeches, you see it in 5 structural signals, and I'm going to explain it to you. Interest payments become one of the fastest growing items in the budget. So you start seeing that interest payments are usually a top priority within your budgets. Borrowing becomes shorter and more expensive, right? The currency forcing inflation and emergency policy tightening. Credit ratings feeling deeper into non-investment grade. Normal market funding being replaced by emergency or last resort financing. That is the shift from chosen adjustment to imposed adjustment. South Africa offers a useful contrast. In 2018, South Africa raised VAT to 15% to close a large revenue gap and signal fiscal credibility to investors, to say, listen, we've got money here in the country. That was not simply a tax change, it was a move to stabilize financing conditions and protect policy autonomy. In 2026, South Africa still borrows mainly in its own currency from a deep domestic capital market. It still writes its own budget, but debt services are one of the fastest growing spending items, which means time is being used. Some countries have room to balance these pressures than others, not because they're morally better, but because they have structural advantages: deep domestic saving, the ability to borrow their own currency, diversified high-value exports, technological and institutional capacity. Those factors make the triangle larger. They allow a state to protect welfare, maintain policy control, and still have time. For countries trying to move outward, the path is always material. Higher long-term growth, domestic capital markets that can fund the state, exporting more complex, higher value goods and services, reliable energy and logistics, and a capable public administration. That is how time is created without surrendering control or cutting social protection. So in 2026, the pattern is clear. Zimbabwe protects control and pays in welfare. Kenya protects financing and pays in policy space. Senegal protects formal sovereignty and pays in time. Different decisions, same system. Because sovereignty today is not the ability to choose any policy at any moment. It is the ability to choose the speed of adjustment. Countries do not collapse when debt rises, they collapse when time runs out.